Al-Qaeda over the years on our troops. And never mind the fact that the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, who changed the name of the group because it's kind of embarrassing to be associated with Al-Qaeda after you've killed as many Americans as you have, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, before he was leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria, was killing Americans, at least 15 that we know of, in Iraq. Actually had him in custody. We'll let him go. And the Biden administration looked at this guy and went, you know what? That is a guy we can work with. We will arm and train him. So will Turkey. So will Israel. We'll work together, and we will install him in power in Syria. It'll be great. Joining me to talk about the absolute and complete disaster that situation is Caleb Maupin, author of multiple books, and one of the few people who actually understands what we did in Syria and the problem it's going to cause. Good morning, Caleb.
Sure. Good morning. How are you?
Good. And I get very frustrated, Caleb, and I just kind of found you and found your work, and I get very frustrated. I think a lot of people think, well, Bashar al-Assad, that sounds like kind of a Muslim name. He's probably a bad guy. I have bad impressions of Syria, so it's probably a good thing that we overthrew him, right?
Well, Bashar Assad and the Syrian Arab Republic were the protectors of religious minorities like Christians. And we're now seeing that this Al-Qaeda individual, now that Syria is under the control of the forces that were working against the Syrian Arab Republic, we're seeing the horrendous crimes that they are committing. The atrocities against the Alawite minority as well as the Christian minority. A mass slaughter is taking place, and there's a huge amount of outrage about it, but this is exactly what these forces said that they would do from the beginning. They made clear their objection to the Syrian government was that it was a government that was allowing religious plurality, that it was a government that was enabling and allowing different religious groups to prosper. They wanted an Islamic state. They wanted Sharia law. They wanted the suppression of religious minorities. And now they're doing exactly what they said they would do. The whole world knew what they were planning to do. They were very open about it. Now they're doing it.
And I don't think the American people are any the wiser. Just absolutely, the group now is called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. There's a couple of other groups as well. Just the absolute horror this weekend of more than 1,000 people being slaughtered. Some are now saying 8 groups on the ground as high as 7,000. Naked women paraded into town and just murdered by the people that we installed and that Joe Biden's administration was trying to figure out how to extend diplomatic relations to just months ago. Can you comment on that? I mean, it's shocking. I don't think Americans understand what we did.
Well, I mean, this seems to fit a pattern. Since the war on terror began, instead of fighting Al-Qaeda, we've been fighting independent and nationalist governments that are enemies of Al-Qaeda. You know, Gaddafi in Libya, he was so opposed to Al-Qaeda, he even volunteered to torture Al-Qaeda folks for us. But Osama bin Laden and those kind of forces have been fighting against the Syrian government. They fought against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. They fought against Gaddafi. But those are the governments that we overthrew. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia, which is a country that is very close to the United States. We have all kinds of business and oil deals, etc. That seems to be where a lot of this Wahhabi ideology that is the basis for these extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS, that seems to be where a lot of it flows from. You know, it gets, U.S. media really tries to make it sound like all Muslims are the same, but it's quite a diversity and it's quite complicated. In the Syrian government, you had Christians, you had Alawites, you had different religious minorities together. It was a secular government, the Syrian Arab Republic. It's been toppled, and now we have a fanatical government that wants to persecute and is actively murdering and exterminating religious minorities. We have that government in power, and that's a huge gift to the terrorists. And it's similar to how the Libyan government was toppled. You know, Libya was a secular government. You had religious minorities and others. It was overthrown, and, you know, ISIS was able to set up shop in Libya. Things in Libya have not been the same since Barack Obama destabilized and overthrew through Libya, and that we have been acting as Al-Qaeda's air force. We topple nationalist and independent governments, and what happens is Al-Qaeda gets stronger, and that this foreign policy, this policy of backing terrorists because we don't like a regime here or there, it's not really panned out. And Tulsi Gabbard, Trump's director of national intelligence, has been one of the people speaking out loudly against it. I was at her confirmation hearing in Washington, D.C., and that was one thing that she stuck to her guns on. She said this is an absolute disaster, and the fact that the leader of Syria is somebody who danced on 9/11 and celebrated the attacks against Americans and the deaths of Americans on 9/11, this is outrageous. And regime change wars and destabilizations, these policies are not benefiting us. The idea that we'll arm terrorists and extremists and back them and whitewash them in American media, say that they're freedom fighters and they're fighters for democracy, and the idea that we'll do that and that'll help us because it'll get rid of a government that we don't like here or we don't like there, that's going to backfire. And we've seen American lives lost. We've seen the rise of ISIS. Backing terrorists is not a good policy.
No, and again, you're not alone. Here is the Tulsi clip I think you're referring to.
Senator, every American deserves to know that people in our own government were providing support to our sworn enemy, Al-Qaeda. That should not be acceptable by anyone.
Yeah. So explain, and this is the one thing that puzzles me. And we obviously, at least we haven't seen the Trump administration do this, but why use Al-Qaeda to overthrow Syria? Syria has not attacked us. There's not been a Syrian terror attack. Why do you think, you're kind of an expert on this, why do you think our government did that under Joe Biden? Why would we support Al-Qaeda? It's almost unfathomable 24 years after 9/11.
Well, I think that there are two very different agendas. I think there's a lot of people in the military, in the FBI, et cetera, who just want to keep Americans safe from terrorism. They want to make sure that events like 9/11 never happened before, never happen again, and that Americans are safe from ISIS and Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks. However, there is another agenda. There is a kind of a globalist agenda of forces tied in with the Council on Foreign Relations, tied in with the various George Soros NGOs, that they're not concerned about keeping Americans safe. They're concerned about this kind of international agenda of spreading human rights, promoting LGBT rights, overthrowing governments that they don't particularly care for. And they almost want instability and chaos around the world to further their internationalist and globalist agenda. And I think the conflict within the government itself is between the people that do just want to fight terrorism and are interested in putting America first, and the forces that are committed to this very kind of globalist, human rights, destabilization, regime change agenda that is contrary to the interests of American working families. And I think that is the real division. It shouldn't really matter to us what kind of government the Syrians have. They have the right to pick their own government, and especially if they have a government that is plural, is letting different religious groups exist, we should let them alone and maybe, do business with them and trade with them. And the same goes for other governments around the world. And let's also remember that, Russia is very good at fighting Al-Qaeda extremists. They were fighting Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan back in the 80s before any of us had ever heard of him. And remember that the Tsarnaev brothers who did the horrendous bombing of the Boston Massacre, they actually went to the U.S. government before the bombing, and they said, watch the Tsarnaev brothers. We've been tracking them online. These Chechens, that they're connected with terrorist groups. They might be doing something. And they were ignored. And we saw the horrendous Boston bombing that took place. And Tulsi Gabbard, people like Michael Flynn, they say, hey, let's work with Russia to fight against Al-Qaeda. Whereas, the liberals and Biden, they have this, oh, Russia bad, Russia's the enemy, we got to fight Russia, LGBT, human rights. And it seems like they'd rather Americans die than cooperate with Russia to fight terrorism and extremism. It's a really, really problematic approach, which the Americans largely rejected at the ballot box. People voted against that approach. They said, we want America first. We want our safety to come first. We'd rather be protected from extremists than have governments that we don't like be overthrown.
Caleb Maupin, where can folks find you and find your work?
Well, I'm with the Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning on 98.9 WORD.